The kitchen was small but warm, the kind of space that carried the faint scent of coffee grounds, no matter how much it was cleaned. Morning light slipped through the blinds in pale golden bars, laying stripes across the laminate countertop where Emily Carter stood, spatula in hand. The eggs in the pan sizzled quietly, their edges crisping just the way Mason liked. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, 7:18 a.m., as though each minute carried a different kind of weight today. The custody hearing wasn't until 10, but Emily had been awake since before dawn, lying in bed, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat, and wondering if the judge would see her as a capable mother or a failure. At the kitchen table, Mason sat in his booster seat, a tangle of messy brown hair and sleepy eyes that still seemed too big for his small face. He was humming something tuneless, stacking brightly colored wooden blocks into lopsided towers that always collapsed before they reached 5 pieces high. His stuffed giraffe, the one he'd dragged everywhere since he could walk, rested on the table beside him. Its once yellow fur faded to a tired beige. "You want toast with peanut butter or jelly today, buddy?" Emily asked without. Turning from the stove, "Peanut butter." "And banana slices," Mason answered matter-of-factly, as if he were dictating to a short-order cook. Emily smiled faintly despite herself. "Yes, sir." "Coming right up." She slid the eggs onto a plate, arranged the toast just the way he liked, and set it in front of him. Mason immediately picked up a slice and began to eat without so much. As a thank you, though, she didn't mind. He was only 3, after all, and his small rituals were what kept him steady in a world that had changed too much in too little time. The world, in Emily's case, meant the slow unraveling of her relationship with Ryan Hawley, the man who had once been charming enough to make her believe in forever, and who now sat on the other side of a custody battle that had consumed the last 8 months of her life. She tried not to think about court while Mason was in the room, but this morning, the thought was a shadow that clung to her no matter what she did. She had replayed it all in her mind so many times. The moment she'd be sworn in, the questions from Ryan's lawyer, the evidence her attorney, Linda Brooks, would present. She wanted to appear calm, capable, and most of all, unshakably protective of Mason. But beneath that practiced composure was a churning fear. Ryan was good at performance. He could walk into a room and make strangers like him in minutes. And he had a way of telling stories that made him sound like the reasonable one, the stable one. Emily knew that if the judge believed even half of what Ryan had implied, that she was prone to emotional outbursts, that she couldn't handle the demands of parenting, she might lose more than just a legal battle. "Mommy?" Mason's voice cut into her thoughts. She turned to see him staring at her with his head tilted slightly, peanut butter clinging to the corner of his mouth. You're making your thinking face again," he said. Emily laughed softly. "What's my thinking face?" "You look like you're trying to see something far away," Mason said seriously. Her heart ached at the strange accuracy of that. "I guess I am," she admitted. She came over, wiped his face with a napkin, and kissed the top of his head. "Don't you worry about me, okay? Today's just an important day." Mason didn't ask why. He rarely did, when adults talked about important days. Instead, he went back to stacking his blocks, but Emily noticed the way he glanced up at her from time to time, as though filing away her mood in that mysterious, silent way toddlers sometimes did. She moved through the rest of the morning like she was checking boxes on a mental list. Wash the dishes, pack Mason's bag with snacks and coloring books for court, make sure the important documents were neatly filed in her tote. She had even ironed her blouse the night before, pale blue, chosen because Linda had once told her it made her look calm and approachable. At 8:30, she ushered Mason into his coat and shoes. He grumbled at the zipper, but held still when she straightened his scarf. The drive downtown was quiet, except for the faint hum of the radio. Emily kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on the gear shift, her eyes flicking between the road and Mason's reflection in the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window, watching the bare winter trees blur past. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Almost there. We'll meet in the hallway before we go in." Emily texted back a quick, got it at a red light, and slipped the phone into her purse. "Where are we going again?" Mason asked suddenly. "To see some nice people who just want to make sure you're safe and happy," Emily said carefully. She'd been coached to keep her language neutral, to avoid making court sound like a scary place. "Will Daddy be there?" Mason asked. "Yes?" Mason was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Will there be the blue room?" Emily's brow furrowed. "The what?" "The blue room," he repeated, still watching the scenery go by. "At Daddy's." Emily almost asked more, but the light turned green and the moment slipped away. Mason was already humming again, distracted by something only he could hear. By the time they reached the courthouse, Emily's stomach was a knot. She parked in the public lot, helped Mason out of the booster seat, and took his small hand in hers. His fingers were warm, his grip firm in a way that reminded her how much she wanted to be the one guiding him through life, no matter how messy. Things had become between her and Ryan. Inside, the air was cooler, the marble floors amplifying every footstep. The courthouse always felt both official and faintly intimidating, the kind of place where the walls seemed to watch. Linda was waiting near the security checkpoint, a tall woman with sharp eyes softened by a reassuring smile. She crouched to Mason's level. "Hey there, champ. Ready for a big adventure?" Mason nodded solemnly, clutching his giraffe in one hand. Emily exhaled slowly. Today would be about keeping her voice steady, her answers precise, and her emotions in check. She had no idea that her greatest piece of evidence would come not from the documents in her tote, nor from Linda's careful arguments, but from her son's unfiltered voice, 2 small words spoken without hesitation. And those words were already sitting quietly in Mason's mind, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The hallway outside courtroom, 4B, smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, the air thick with the low murmur of voices from other cases waiting to be called. Emily sat on a wooden bench beside Mason, her knees pressed together, her tote bag tucked neatly against her leg. Her attorney, Linda Brooks, stood a few feet away, speaking in a low tone to a clerk, glancing back occasionally as if to check that Emily hadn't vanished. Emily kept her eyes on the pale marble tiles beneath her feet. She had been in this courthouse twice before for preliminary hearings, but today's session was different. Today was when Judge Carolyn Finch would hear both sides fully and decide whether Mason's custody arrangement would remain shared or be altered. 8 months earlier, she never could have imagined sitting here like this. She and Ryan had once been inseparable, at least in the early days. They'd met at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, where Ryan had arrived with that easy smile and half-buttoned shirt that seemed almost scripted. He'd made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years, and by the end of the evening, they'd been leaning close, speaking like old friends. The first year was whirlwind romance. Trips to small-town fairs, weekend hikes, lazy Sundays, with takeout cartons scattered on the coffee table. When she found out she was pregnant, Ryan had hugged her and promised they'd build something strong, something lasting. But the cracks came quickly. Arguments over bills and late nights out turned into arguments about her tone, about her attitude. The man who once brought her coffee in bed now raised his voice over small things, the laundry not done, the way she loaded the dishwasher. His charm could turn off like a light switch. The breaking point came one cold February night when Mason was barely a year old. Ryan had come home smelling of alcohol, slamming the door hard enough to wake the baby. Words turned to shouting. Shouting turned to slammed drawers and doors, and Emily, clutching Mason to her chest, realized she could not raise her son in a house that felt like a fuse about to blow. Leaving hadn't been easy. For a while, they'd managed a fragile truce, splitting weekends, exchanging Mason at a neutral drop-off point. But when Emily started asking more questions about Mason's time at Ryan's apartment, things shifted. Ryan pushed back, accusing her of being paranoid, of making drama. Then came the papers, a formal request for full custody. Ryan's petition painted her as unstable, claiming she had emotional outbursts and a history of erratic behavior. Reading it, Emily had felt the breath knocked out of her. She had no criminal record, no history with Child Protective Services. Nothing to justify such claims. But Ryan's lawyer was skilled, and Emily knew that in family court, perception could be as dangerous as proof. That was when she hired Linda Brooks. Linda wasn't flashy. She didn't rely on theatrics, but she had a reputation for methodically dismantling the other side's narrative. In their first meeting, she'd sat across from Emily, pen tapping lightly against her legal pad, and said, "We'll need to show the court that Mason is safe, stable, and thriving with you, and that there's reasonable cause to question whether Ryan's home provides the same." Emily had provided what she could: pediatric records showing Mason's consistent health, notes from his preschool teacher praising his progress, photos of his tidy bedroom with its soft blue quilt and shelves lined with picture books. But Linda's real interest was in Ryan's living conditions. She'd heard whispers from a mutual acquaintance about late-night gatherings at his apartment, about people coming and going at odd hours. But gossip wasn't evidence, and without proof, it would never hold up in front of Judge Finch, which brought them here to this morning. Across the hallway, Ryan emerged from the elevator, his lawyer at his side. He was dressed in a dark suit, hair neatly styled, his expression calm, but his eyes found Emily instantly. He gave a brief nod that was neither friendly nor hostile, just calculated. The same expression he'd worn the night he'd handed her those custody papers, as if he were already confident of victory. Mason didn't notice him. He was busy, flipping through a picture book Emily had brought from home. Linda returned and sat beside them, placing a hand on Emily's arm. "Here's the plan," Linda murmured. "We'll start with your testimony about Mason's daily routine, then present the photos. Then we'll address Ryan's claims point by point. If the judge allows, I'll ask him about the living arrangements directly. No accusations, just questions he has to answer under oath." Emily nodded, her throat tight. What if she believes him? "Then we appeal," Linda said without hesitation. "But I don't think it will come to that. He's careful, but I've seen careful people slip." The bailiff opened the heavy courtroom door and called the case Carter versus Holly. Emily rose, smoothing the front of her blouse, and took Mason's hand. Inside, the air was cooler, and the hum of voices stopped as the judge entered. They stood, then sat again as the proceedings began. Judge Finch was a woman in her late 50s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, her voice measured but firm. She listened intently as Linda began questioning Emily about Mason's life, his preschool schedule, his favorite foods, his bedtime routine. Emily answered steadily, reminding herself to keep her gaze on the judge, not on Ryan. When Ryan's attorney cross-examined her, the tone shifted. The questions were sharp, pointed, designed to plant seeds of doubt. Did she ever raise her voice at Mason? Had she ever missed a scheduled exchange? How often did she vent to friends about being overwhelmed? Emily kept her answers truthful, but calm, refusing to be rattled. Ryan took the stand next, his voice smooth as he spoke about providing stability and offering Mason a balanced environment. He described his apartment as child-friendly and himself as committed to positive co-parenting. Emily sat still, but inside, her frustration simmered. She knew how convincing he could sound. The judge leaned back, folding her hands. "Before we proceed to closing statements," she said, "I'd like to hear briefly from Mason. He is present, correct?" Emily's pulse skipped. Mason sat beside her, swinging his legs, a stuffed giraffe in his lap. The judge's request was unusual, but not unheard of in family court. Sometimes a brief, informal chat could give insight into a child's comfort level. She turned her kindest expression on Mason. "Hello there, Mason. Are you doing okay today?" And in that quiet moment, before anyone could predict the weight of it, Mason opened his mouth and gave the answer that would crack the case wide. Open, 2 words. But those words would come in the next beat, and nothing in this long, exhausting custody battle would ever be the same after them. The room felt cooler than the hallway outside, as though the air conditioning was set just a degree lower in the courtroom to keep people sharp. Light streamed in through tall, narrow windows, glinting off the polished wood of the judge's bench. Emily sat at the petitioner's table, Mason in the small chair beside her, his little legs swinging back and forth like pendulums that didn't know the rhythm. Linda Brooks sat on Emily's other side, pen in hand, legal pad at the ready. Across the aisle, Ryan sat with his attorney, both leaning in as they exchanged quiet words. Emily kept her focus on Judge Carolyn Finch, who had been presiding with the same calm, deliberate tone she was known for. There was nothing rushed about her. She weighed each word she spoke and each answer she heard, as if every syllable could tip the scales. "Mr. High," the judge said, closing the file before her, "thank you for your testimony. We will now—" She paused, her gaze shifting toward Mason. Emily's heart gave a small jump. The judge's expression softened just slightly, the kind of shift adults make when speaking to children. "I see the young man at the center of this case is present today," she said, her voice lighter now. "Mason, is that your name?" Mason nodded, still holding his stuffed giraffe like it was a passport that allowed him safe passage through unfamiliar territory. Judge Finch smiled faintly. "And how are you feeling today?" There was a brief silence, filled only by the faint creak of someone shifting in the back row. Emily expected him to shrug, or maybe say, "Fine." Mason wasn't shy exactly, but he was usually cautious with strangers, especially ones in robes. Instead, he sat up a little straighter, turned his head toward the judge, and in a clear, steady voice said, "Blue room." 2 syllables. The words seemed to hover in the air, almost visible. Emily felt a strange, hollow stillness spread through her chest. She didn't look at Ryan right away. She didn't have to. She could feel his reaction before she saw it. From the corner of her eye, she caught the way his shoulders tensed, the slight flicker of his jaw as he clenched his teeth. His lawyer leaned closer, whispering something sharp and fast. The judge's brows lifted just slightly. "The blue room?" she repeated, as though testing the phrase. Mason nodded again, more emphatically this time, as if he were confirming something important. Emily swallowed hard. She'd heard those 2 words before, scattered across the past few months. Bedtime murmurs, fragments of toddler storytelling about toys and colors, and half-remembered scenes. She had brushed it off as harmless, like talking about a dream. But here, in this moment, it landed differently. "Could you tell me what the blue room is, Mason?" Judge Finch asked, her voice careful, neither pressing nor dismissing. Mason hesitated, as if he were considering how to explain something too big for words. Then he said, "It's at Daddy's." Emily finally glanced toward Ryan. He was staring at his folded hands now, the tips of his ears reddening. His attorney shifted uncomfortably. Linda leaned subtly toward Emily and whispered, Do you know what he's talking about? Emily's mind spun. Not exactly, she whispered back. He's mentioned it before, but I've never been there. Judge Finch's gaze flicked to Linda. Miss Brooks, does this blue room hold any relevance to the matter at hand? Linda straightened. Your Honor, my client informs me she's unfamiliar with it beyond her son's occasional mention. Given Mr. Hale's history of denying home access during exchanges, I believe it warrants clarification. Ryan's lawyer spoke up quickly. Your Honor, it's nothing unusual. My client has a spare bedroom painted blue. It's entirely irrelevant to these proceedings. The judge didn't respond right away. She studied Ryan for a long moment, the way a chess player studies a board before deciding whether to sacrifice a pawn. Mr. Hall, do you object to answering a few brief questions about this room? Ryan lifted his chin slightly. Of course not. As my counsel said, it's just a spare room for guests. Painted blue, that's all. His voice was steady, but it carried the faint tightness of someone forcing themselves to stay composed. Linda rose. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to ask a few questions now. Permission was granted. Mr. Hale, Linda began, her tone neutral. How often does Mason spend time in this blue room? Ryan hesitated. Not often. He prefers his own room when he visits. Is the blue room furnished? Yes. Bed, dresser, knitstand. Any other items? A few boxes. Storage stuff. Linda paused, pen poised above her notes. Would you be willing to allow a court-appointed investigator to view the room this afternoon? That was when Emily saw it, the pause. Barely a heartbeat, but it was there. Ryan's eyes darted to his lawyer before he answered, If that's necessary, sure. Judge Finch leaned back slightly. I think it may be. Let's take a short recess while arrangements are made. Mr. Hale, please provide access to the investigator upon arrival. The gavel tapped once, sharp and final. As people began to move, the hum of low voices returning, Emily sat frozen. Mason was tugging at her sleeve, wanting to know if it was snack time yet. She looked down at him, this small person who had just thrown open a door neither she nor Linda had been able to find the key to. Blue room, he said again, almost to himself, as if the words were nothing more than a color and a place. Emily brushed his hair back from his forehead and managed to smile. Yeah, buddy, she whispered. The blue room. In that instant, she understood. Whatever was behind that door was about to change the direction of this case completely. And it had all begun with 2 words from the smallest voice in the room. The courtroom door closed with a soft but deliberate click as people settled back into their seats after the brief recess. The overhead lights seemed a little brighter now, almost too bright, making the polished wood gleam. Emily sat with her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, forcing herself to keep her breathing even. Mason sat beside her, his little sneakers scuffing against the floor as he swung his legs, humming quietly, as if this were just another ordinary day. But nothing about the moment felt ordinary. The 2 words, blue room, still hung in the air, unshakable. They had cracked the careful rhythm of the hearing, shifting it into uncharted territory. Emily could sense it in the way people moved, slower now, more deliberate, and in the way eyes darted toward Ryan when they thought no one was watching. Across the aisle, Ryan was back in his chair, one hand resting on the table, the other tapping a slow, irregular rhythm against his knee. His attorney leaned close, speaking low and fast. Ryan nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the space in front of him, as though he were staring at something only he could see. Judge Carolyn Finch returned to her bench, her expression unreadable, but her gaze steady. We will resume, she said, her voice calm but carrying the quiet authority that could cut through any room. Before we proceed with further testimony, I'd like to address the matter that arose prior to recess. She shifted her attention to Ryan. Mr. Hall, you have indicated the blue room in your home is a spare bedroom, used infrequently, and containing storage. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Ryan replied smoothly, though Emily caught the faint hitch before the words left his mouth. Very well, Judge Finch said. Given that this case concerns the safety and well-being of a minor child, and given the child's unsolicited mention of this room, I find it prudent to authorize an immediate inspection by the court-appointed investigator. The decision landed with quiet finality. There were no gasps, no dramatic protests, just a subtle shift in the air, like the first cool breeze before a storm. Linda Brooks rose from her chair, her voice professional, but edged with intent. Your Honor, for the record, my client had limited visibility into the living arrangements at Mr. Hale's residence due to prior restrictions on her access. We welcome this inspection as an opportunity to clarify any outstanding concerns. Ryan's attorney cleared his throat. We maintain that the room is irrelevant to these proceedings, but we will, of course, comply with the court's directive. Emily watched Ryan closely. His jaw was set, the muscle there working as if he were grinding his teeth. His hands, though, betrayed him, one now clenched into a loose fist, the other drumming against the table as if to keep himself anchored. Judge Finch nodded once. Mr. O'Neill will conduct the inspection immediately. In the meantime, we will proceed with other matters on the docket and reconvene once his report is complete. The bailiff stepped forward to coordinate logistics with Ryan, speaking in low tones. Emily didn't hear the details, but she saw Ryan hand over a set of keys with a sharp, almost careless flick of his wrist. When the bailiff and investigator left, the courtroom felt oddly suspended, as though everyone was waiting for something they couldn't yet name. Emily leaned slightly toward Linda. Do you think? Sure, Linda murmured, her eyes still on the judge. Let's see where this goes before we speculate. They shifted into the next scheduled witness. A brief statement from Mason's preschool teacher about his attendance and behavior. Emily tried to focus, nodding politely at the kind words being said about her son, but her mind kept drifting back to the phrase Mason had spoken so casually. Blue room. She could hear it in his voice even now, not frightened, not secretive, just a fact in his small world, no different from saying the park or the playground. And that, she thought, might be what made it so powerful. Children didn't frame their words for effect. They didn't know how to spin stories for an audience. If Mason had said it, he had seen it. And if he had seen it, then whatever was in that room was real. Across the aisle, Ryan shifted in his chair, checking his watch twice in the span of a minute. His calm facade was starting to fray, though most people in the room wouldn't notice. Emily noticed. She had spent years watching his expressions for the smallest changes, the quiet signs that trouble was coming. When the preschool teacher stepped down, Judge Finch glanced at the clock. We will recess until we have the investigator's report. Counsel, please remain available. As the courtroom emptied into the hallway, Emily felt Linda's hand on her elbow, guiding her toward a quieter corner. Mason trailed behind, clutching his giraffe, his eyes scanning the marble floor for some invisible pattern. You've been holding back on me, Linda said quietly, though her tone wasn't accusing, more like she was piecing together a puzzle. What do you mean? Emily asked. This blue room? You've heard him mention it before. Haven't you? Emily hesitated. A few times, yeah. Mostly at night. I thought it was, imaginary. Kids make up places. Linda studied her for a moment. Maybe, but in my experience, when kids repeat something over and over without context, it's usually because they've actually seen it, and it means something to them. Not always something bad, but something. Emily felt a small chill crawl across the back of her neck. What do you think's in there? Linda shook her head. Doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what's actually there. And we're about to find out. They didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, the bailiff reappeared, followed by investigator James O'Neill. His expression was neutral, professional, but Emily noticed the way he carried the manila folder in his hand, not tucked away, but held like something that needed to be delivered immediately. Ryan, now standing by his attorney, glanced at the folder and then away, as though refusing to give it the dignity of his full attention. "Your Honor," O'Neill said, addressing the bench, "I've completed the inspection. I have photographs and a written summary for the court's review." Emily's pulse quickened. She looked at Mason, who was yawning now, oblivious to the tension swirling around him. Judge Finch accepted the folder, flipping it open without a word. For a few moments, the only sound was the soft rustle of pages. Then she looked up, and her eyes, usually calm and measured, had a new sharpness to them. "We will reconvene in 10 minutes, she said. The gavel tapped once, but the sound rang louder than before. Emily knew then, whatever was in that room, it wasn't just a spare bedroom with blue walls. It was something that had shifted the judge's expression, sharpened her focus, and maybe tilted the scales of this case in a way Ryan hadn't expected. And it had all started with 2 words from a toddler who hadn't even been asked a question. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere had changed. It was subtle, but Emily could feel it in her skin. The hum of whispered conversations had grown sharper, more urgent. Even the way the bailiff stood, hands clasped in front of him, seemed different, like he was holding back knowledge. Judge Finch adjusted her glasses and addressed the room. "Before we proceed with closing statements, the court has received the investigator's report regarding the premises of Mr. Hale's residence, specifically the so-called Blue Room. I will summarize its contents for the record." Emily's breath caught. Mason sat beside her, completely unaware, his attention fixed on tracing the grain of the wooden table with his fingertip. The judge opened the manila folder again. Her voice remained steady, but there was a weight to each sentence. Investigator. James O'Neill arrived at Mr. Hale's residence at 12:14 p.m. The subject granted access to the apartment and accompanied the investigator to the blue-painted room in question. The door was found locked with a padlock. Upon request, Mr. Howell produced the key. That single fact, locked, seemed to ripple through the room. Emily saw Linda's pen pause in midair. Inside, the judge continued, the walls were painted cobalt blue. The room contained an air mattress on the floor, partially deflated with used bedding. Several empty beer bottles and an open case of alcohol were present. There were also unsecured tools, including a hammer, box cutter, and electrical cords within a child's reach. Emily's stomach tightened. She kept her gaze fixed on the judge, but her peripheral vision caught the shift in Ryan's posture, his shoulders curling slightly inward. The investigator noted. Judge Finch went on. A strong odor of cigarette smoke and evidence of recent gatherings, including ashtrays with fresh residue. Additionally, boxes stacked in one corner contained adult magazines and DVDs, many with explicit content visible on their covers. Now the room was utterly silent. No one moved. The weight of the words filled every inch of air. Emily's hands were cold, her fingertips tingling. Mason had played in that apartment. She had assumed under safe conditions. The judge glanced down at the papers again. Photographs of the room have been entered into the record. She slid them toward the clerk, who began distributing copies to counsel. Linda took hers, flipping each image toward Emily with the discreet speed of someone who knew the content might be upsetting. Emily only glanced, and that was enough. The deep blue walls loomed in the frame, littered with shadows from the thin clutter. The air mattress looked small and sad in the corner, surrounded by the chaotic sprawl of objects that had no place near a child. "Mr. Hall," Judge Finch said, her tone sharpening, "do you wish to explain the purpose of this room? And why it was locked?" Ryan leaned forward slightly, his lawyer's hand on his arm. His voice was calm, but quieter than before. "It's just a room I use when friends crash for the night. I keep some of my things there, and I lock it so Mason won't get into anything dangerous." Linda rose instantly. "Your Honor, with respect, the condition of that room and its contents raise significant safety concerns, both from the unsecured hazardous items and from the nature of the materials found. The fact that it was locked does not negate the presence of these hazards. Rather, it underscores that Mr. Hawley knew their potential danger." Ryan's lawyer interjected, "The room is not where the child sleeps, and my client has taken reasonable precautions." "Reasonable precautions," Linda repeated, "do not include keeping alcohol, sharp tools, and explicit materials in an environment where a toddler lives, even part-time. And the existence of such a space calls into question the overall suitability of that environment." The judge lifted a hand. "Enough. I have reviewed the photographs and the investigator's notes. They speak for themselves." She looked directly at Ryan now. "Mr. Hall, your obligation as a parent, whether primary or shared, is to provide a safe and healthy environment for your child. What I have seen does not meet that standard." Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. Judge Finch continued, "Until further notice, Mr. Hale's visitation will be restricted to supervised settings only. An additional home inspection will be conducted in 30 days, at which point the court will reassess the situation. This is not a punitive measure. It is a protective one." Ryan's expression was unreadable for a moment, then settled into something tight and guarded. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Beside Emily, Mason tugged at her sleeve. She leaned down, and he whispered, "Did I do good?" Her throat tightened. She brushed a hand through his hair and whispered, "Back, you did great, buddy." Linda closed her folder with deliberate care, leaning toward Emily. "That was the break we needed," she murmured. Emily nodded, though her relief was tempered by the image of the room in her mind. She couldn't stop picturing the air mattress in that cobalt space, surrounded by those things. She wondered if Mason had ever stepped inside, or if he'd only glimpsed it from the doorway. The judge moved on to finalize other procedural matters, but the case had shifted. The blue room was no longer a throwaway detail in a toddler's vocabulary. It was evidence, stark and undeniable. When court adjourned for the day, Emily gathered Mason's things. Reporters were clustered outside the courtroom doors, murmuring to each other, some clearly aware that something unusual had happened in the hearing. Emily kept her head down as they stepped into the hallway, Mason's small hand tucked securely in hers. As they walked toward the elevators, Linda fell into step beside her. "That room may have just saved your custody arrangement," she said quietly. "But more importantly, it might have kept him safe." Emily glanced down at Mason, who was swinging his giraffe by the leg, humming under his breath. He was blissfully unaware that two casual words had just detonated in the middle of a legal proceeding. And Emily knew she would never again dismiss anything he said as just toddler talk. James O'Neill had been inside hundreds of homes in his 12 years as a court-appointed investigator. He'd seen messy kitchens, hoarded garages, immaculate living rooms that clearly had been staged for inspection. But when Ryan Hawley unlocked the blue room, he knew this was different. It started with the click of the padlock, loud in the otherwise quiet apartment. The hallway here was narrow, lit by a single bulb that buzzed faintly. Ryan stood to the side, arms crossed loosely, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as though daring O'Neill to be impressed. The door swung open, and O'Neill took a single step inside. The smell hit him first. Not one smell, but layers. Stale cigarette smoke, cheap beer, the musty damp of unwashed fabric. It clung to the back of his throat instantly. His eyes adjusted to the cobalt blue walls. At first glance, they might have been striking in a different context, deep, almost velvety. But here, in this dim, cluttered space, they felt oppressive, pressing the room inward. In the far corner, an air mattress sagged under a pile of tangled bedding. The sheets were wrinkled and stained, the kind of disarray that spoke of repeated use without care. A single pillow lay without a case, flattened from long wear. O'Neill's attention drifted to the floor around the mattress. A scatter of bottle caps, crumpled fast food wrappers, and, disturbingly, a broken lighter. Against the opposite wall, several beer bottles stood in a haphazard line, some half full, some with the amber residue of stale liquid at the bottom. He crouched to inspect a stack of boxes in the corner. The cardboard was warped and dented, the top flaps half open. Inside, adult magazines were piled loosely, covers in plain view. DVDs leaned against the side of the box, titles leaving little to the imagination. He noted each one, his pen scratching quickly against his pad. Next to the boxes, tools lay scattered on the floor. A hammer with a worn grip, a box cutter, partially open, and several lengths of electrical cord tangled like snakes. A small plastic bin nearby held nails, screws, and other hardware, all within easy reach. "Do you keep this door locked at all times?" O'Neill asked without looking. Brian shifted his weight. "Yeah, Mason's not allowed in here. He knows better." "Where is the key normally kept?" "In my pocket." Ryan's voice was clipped, almost defensive now. O'Neill made another note. He moved to the single window in the room. It was shut, the glass cloudy with a film of dust and nicotine. The blinds were crooked, one slat bent at an odd angle. On the sill sat an ashtray, still warm to the touch, the faint smoke curling upward from a stubbed-out cigarette. "You smoke in here?" O'Neill asked. Ryan shrugged. "Sometimes." "So what?" O'Neill didn't respond. He walked the perimeter of the room, methodically noting each item, photographing each section. The cobalt paint seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it, making shadows deepen in the corners. Near the mattress, he spotted a crayon, red, dulled from use, lying on the floor. That gave him pause. It was the only sign of anything remotely childlike in the room. He crouched, picking it up with a gloved hand, bagging it with practiced ease. He turned to Ryan. "How did this get in here?" Ryan frowned, as though trying to recall. "No idea. Maybe Mason dropped it once when he was with me." "Was the room locked then?" Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "Yeah, probably. I mean, I don't remember." O'Neill knew better than to press further right then. He'd learned long ago that people told you more with their pauses than with their answers. The last corner of the room held a narrow shelf with mismatched items, an old radio, a stack of paper plates, a jar half filled with coins, and a roll of duct tape. Next to it sat a pair of men's boots, their soles worn thin. He stepped back into the hallway, clicking the camera off. "I've seen enough." Ryan leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. "Like I said, it's just a crash space, harmless." O'Neill looked at him evenly. "It's not harmless when you're sharing a home with a 4-year-old. He locked the door again, this time slipping the padlock key into his own pocket until the inspection was formally complete. The drive back to the courthouse was quiet. O'Neill replayed the scene in his mind, the way the room seemed to breathe. In its own stale air, the juxtaposition of a child's crayon against adult chaos, the low hum of something unsaid. By the time he handed the folder to Judge Finch, the words he'd chosen for his report were careful but clear. The room contains multiple safety hazards, adult-oriented materials, and signs of regular use inconsistent with safe cohabitation. For a minor child, he knew the photographs would speak louder than the paragraphs. They always did. But there was one thing photographs couldn't capture: the feeling, the instinct that told him this room wasn't just cluttered or careless. It was wrong. Later, as he stepped out of the courtroom after getting his summary, he caught Emily's eyes across the hall. She didn't speak, but he saw the flicker of recognition there, the kind you only get when someone confirms something you'd been afraid to believe. And in the back of his mind, O'Neill kept circling the same detail. That single red crayon on the floor. It didn't belong in the blue room, and yet, somehow, it did. The elevator ride down from the courthouse felt longer than the entire hearing. Emily stood with Mason's small hand clutched in hers, Linda beside her, while Ryan leaned against the opposite wall with his lawyer. The mirrored walls caught every flicker of expression. Emily's guarded calm, Linda's quiet satisfaction, Ryan's simmering glare. When the doors opened into the marble-floored lobby, the sound of reporters' voices surged toward them. Microphones, cameras, and notepads bristled like a wall of weapons. "Ms. Parker, is it true your son's testimony influenced the judge's decision?" "Mr. Hawley, what exactly is the Blue Room?" Emily tightened her grip on Mason and pushed forward without answering. Linda used her briefcase like a shield, guiding them toward the revolving doors. Ryan didn't answer either, not verbally. But as Emily passed him, she felt the heat of his gaze on the side of her face, sharp as a blade. Outside, the February air was cold enough to sting. Emily crouched to zip Mason's jacket, brushing a curl from his forehead. "We're going home, okay?" she said softly. Mason smiled, oblivious to the tension. "Can I have mac and cheese?" She managed a small laugh. "Yes, you can have mac and cheese." Linda's car pulled up to the curb, and Emily ushered Mason into the back seat. As she was closing the door, Ryan's voice cut through the traffic noise. "This isn't over, Emily." She froze, one hand on the door handle. Slowly she turned to face him. He stood a few feet away, hands buried in his coat pockets, the wind flattening his hair against his forehead. His tone was steady, but there was something under it, not just anger, but calculation. "You think a locked room and a few pictures change everything?" he said. "You've been waiting for me to slip up, but you don't know half the story." Linda stepped between them, her voice low but firm. "Mr. Howe, any further contact needs to go through counsel." Ryan smirked faintly. "Yeah, counsel, got it." He turned and walked toward the parking lot without looking back. Emily got into the car, but her pulse stayed high for the entire drive. Ryan's words looped in her head. "You don't know half the story." That night, after Mason was asleep, Emily sat in the kitchen with a mug of tea gone cold. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She pulled out the photographs Linda had given her earlier, copies from the investigator's report. She spread them across the table like puzzle pieces, scanning each one for details she might have missed in court. The air mattress, the bottles, the tools, the adult magazines. And in the middle of it all, that single red crayon. Emily traced it with her finger on the glossy paper. The crayon was so ordinary, so harmless, yet here it seemed almost like an intruder in the scene. She thought back to the last time Mason had come home from Ryan's. He'd been quieter than usual, clutching his stuffed giraffe tighter than normal. She'd asked him if he had fun, and he'd nodded. But then, after a pause, he'd whispered, "The Blue Room is scary." She hadn't pressed then. She should have. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. You don't understand what you've started. She stared at it for a long time before locking the screen. 2 days later, Emily got a call from O'Neill. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Ms. Parker, I wanted to let you know the follow-up investigation has been scheduled earlier than planned. Something about the blue room doesn't sit right with me. Emily felt the hairs on her arms rise. What do you mean? I can't say yet, O'Neill said, but the arrangement of the room didn't feel accidental, like it was meant to look a certain way for us to see. Emily's mind flashed back to Ryan's smirk in the hallway before unlocking the door. Meant to look a certain way? She echoed. Exactly, O'Neill said. Sometimes the most telling evidence isn't what's there, it's what's missing. Before she could ask more, he ended the call. That weekend, Mason was playing with his blocks on the living room floor when he picked up a blue one and held it out. This is like the walls, he said casually. Emily crouched beside him. The walls where, sweetheart? In Daddy's blue room, Mason replied. Then, almost as an afterthought, but it's not the real blue room. The real ones. Somewhere else. Emily's breath caught. Somewhere else? Mason nodded, already turning back to his blocks, as though he'd said nothing remarkable. Yeah, that one's for hiding. Emily's skin prickled. She wanted to ask more, but something in her gut told her not to push. Not yet. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. She stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly and then faded. Ryan's earlier words returned, heavier now. You don't know half the story. If Mason was right, if there was another blue room, then everything they'd uncovered so far was only the surface. And the worst part was, she had no idea what might be beneath it. 2 weeks after the initial hearing, Emily received a call from Investigator O'Neill at 6:17 a.m. His voice was taut, urgent. Ms. Parker, I need you at the courthouse today. We found something. Emily's grip tightened on the phone. Something what? There was a pause, like he was measuring the weight of his words. Another room. The one your son mentioned. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. By the time Emily and Linda arrived, the air in the courthouse felt charged, like the minutes before a thunderstorm breaks. Ryan was already there, sitting stiffly beside his attorney. His jaw was set, but his fingers drummed a restless rhythm against his knee. Judge Finch entered, her robe flowing as she took her seat. The room quieted instantly. Mr. O'Neill, she said, you indicated in your report that there was further evidence to present? O'Neill stood, a slim folder in hand. Yes, Your Honor. During a follow-up inspection of Mr. Hale's property, we discovered a concealed space not accessible during the initial visit. This second location contained features matching the child's descriptions of a real blue room. A low murmur ran through the courtroom. Emily's pulse thudded in her ears. O'Neill opened the folder and began placing photographs. On the evidence table, each more unsettling than the last. This room was located in the detached garage behind Mr. Hale's apartment building, O'Neill said. The entrance was hidden behind a freestanding tool cabinet. Once moved, we found a reinforced door, painted over to blend with the wall. The first photo showed the garage, cluttered, ordinary. The next revealed the disguised door. When we entered, O'Neill continued, the space inside was windowless. The walls were painted the same deep cobalt as the apartment's blue room, but the atmosphere was markedly different. He laid down the next photo. Emily felt the breath leave her lungs. The room was nearly empty, except for a narrow cot, a small metal table, and a single chair bolted to the floor. The lighting was harsh, a single bulb in a caged fixture. Against one wall, A large corkboard was covered in pinned photographs, all turned so their faces weren't visible in the image. Next to it sat a small, locked cabinet. "We also found audio recording equipment," O'Neill said. 2 microphones wired to a portable recorder with dates and times labeled. Several tapes correspond to nights when the child was reportedly visiting. Emily's hands clenched into fists under the table. "Your Honor," Ryan's attorney interjected, "there is no proof these items were used for anything illegal. My client uses this space for personal projects." O'Neill's gaze didn't waver. "With respect, counsel, there's no plausible explanation for a locked, soundproofed room in a detached garage, particularly one matching a 4-year-old's unsolicited description." Judge Finch's expression hardened. "Mr. Hall, do you wish to explain the purpose of this second room?" Ryan leaned forward, his voice calm but with an edge. "It's just a space where I go to be alone. That's it. The rest of this is a witch hunt." O'Neill slid the final photograph onto the table. It showed a red crayon lying on the metal table in the garage's blue room. Emily felt her stomach turn. "This was recovered during the search," O'Neill said. "It's the same brand and shade as the crayon found in the apartment's blue room. This suggests the child was in the garage room at least once." Ryan's attorney stood. "Objection. Overruled," Judge Finch said sharply. "Mr. Hall, I find your explanation wholly inadequate and your disregard for this court alarming. Effective immediately, visitation is suspended pending a full investigation by law enforcement. The child will remain in Miss Parker's care." The gavel struck. In the hallway afterward, Ryan was flanked by 2 deputies. He glanced over his shoulder at Emily as they guided him away. "This isn't finished," he said, the words low but clear. "You think you won, but you don't know what you just set in motion." Emily didn't answer. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself toward the exit, O'Neill and Linda walking on either side of her. "Is it over?" she asked O'Neill quietly. "Not yet," he said. "But you and Mason are safer now than you were yesterday. That's what matters." That night, Emily tucked Mason into bed. He snuggled into his pillow, clutching his stuffed giraffe. "Mommy?" he said softly. "Yes, sweetheart? Do we have to talk about the blue rooms anymore?" Emily smoothed his hair. "No, not anymore." She turned off the light, closing the door most of the way. In the quiet, she let herself exhale for the first time all day. But as she sat alone in the living room later, the image of that red crayon in the second blue room came back to her, vivid, impossible to shake. And in the deepest part of her gut, Emily knew Ryan was right about one thing. This wasn't over. Not yet.